Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. Mich Ciurria is a disabled queer philosopher working across intersectionality, feminist philosophy, critical disability theory, justice studies, and biopolitical philosophy. In Crip Pessimism, she argues that the great evils may not disappear and that the barriers to disabled life have barely budged. In her work on moral responsibility, she examines how the impaired agent anchors the boundary of the responsible subject and how the objective attitude authorizes management over recognition. And in a recent article in Biopolitical Philosophy titled Techno-Fascists Are Ruining the World, she challenges the narrative of unprecedented crisis, tracing how techno-fascism intensifies overwork, extraction, incarceration, environmental devastation, and mass disablement under the banner of innovation. Welcome to the show, Mitch.
Thank you so much.
I want to begin by your article, Crip Pessimism. You begin not with an abstraction, but with a lived professional stagnation. Disabled philosophers pushed to the margins, complaints filed, careers stalled. You write that barriers have barely budged. What does that recurrence reveal about how ableism operates within liberal institutions?
Yeah, good question. So I guess it's a broader problem. I start that post by talking about how a lot of my disabled colleagues don't work in philosophy departments because they couldn't get jobs in philosophy. They felt alienated in philosophy. And then some of those who do work in philosophy have filed discrimination lawsuits because they've experienced ableist discrimination that has prevented them from continuing in their job. And I think this is clearly a broader problem in neoliberal economies where disabled people comprise a small percentage of the labor force. So I think in the United States, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, disabled people make up about 20% of the workforce. And that figure has been pretty stable since the 90s. I don't think it's changed that much since the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced. So there's this stable, high rate of unemployment for disabled people. And of course, that's because the built environment was constructed to exclude disabled people. So even if we introduce more rights within the neoliberal rights-based framework, that's not going to change those structural barriers that continue to exclude and marginalize disabled people. So yeah, I think this is a broader problem with disabled people consistently being excluded from the workforce and denied access to a wage, essentially.
In that same essay, you introduce the idea or engage with the idea that the great evils may not disappear. And that challenges the assumption that injustice naturally declines over time. If ableism persists through reform, what does that do to the moral language of progress?
Yeah, so I'm skeptical of the notion of consistent linear progress, which a lot of 20th century neoliberal philosophers believed in, especially white men who were very socially privileged. So they were quite optimistic about the future. They talked about capitalism being the end of history. So capitalism is kind of the natural culmination of historical forces, and it will bring maximum prosperity to people, which is quite different than the Marxist understanding. So yeah, the reason I wrote that essay was because I kept being I kept being invited to give talks on how to improve accessibility and disability justice in academia. And I just felt like it was kind of pointless when philosophy hasn't made any progress. It's made very minimal progress over the course of my lifetime. So it just seemed very pointless to give these like optimistic talks that kind of sanitize structural ableism within the profession, making it seem more temporary and transitory than it really is. So I just decided to present a more pessimistic outlook on which the profession probably isn't going to change in my lifetime. When people ask me if they should disclose a disability or major in philosophy with a disability, I can't tell them that they're going to like find a climate of acceptance or good job prospects, especially given that I have never had stable employment in this profession. So I'm kind of like a
Y-
cautionary tale for disabled,
Yeah,
prospective disabled philosophers. So yeah, I just wanted to focus on the pessimistic side and the idea that we have to survive within these non-ideal, actually dystopian social and professional conditions.
you describe disability as socially constructed deficit, meaning lack of autonomy, productivity, rational control, traits that anchor moral responsibility. When those traits define the responsible subject, who is stabilized at the center?
I work on so my work on responsibility and disability, I talk about how sorry, my cats are I have a lot of cats and they might make some noise in the background. Um, okay, so in my work on responsibility, I talk about how responsibility theorists tend to assume the medical model, which defines disability as an individual impairment as opposed to a contingent social construct. So, as a result, yeah, they essentially center the non disabled, neurotypical, neoliberal subject as the epitome or paradigmatic case of responsibility. So, everyone who falls outside of this schema is described as non responsible or a marginal case of responsibility. So, responsibility theory, in that sense, reproduces ableism in its discourses on how disabled people are basically morally and socially dysfunctional. And I can elaborate on that if you want.
Yeah, please.
Okay, apologies. Yeah, so I kind of use P.F. Strawson as a paradigmatic example. He wrote a famous essay on how responsibility is the capacity to respond to the reactive attitudes. And in that essay, he uses what we would consider ableist language to talk about how compulsives and hopeless schizophrenics and even people with mild psychological disorders, I'm scare quotes here, are outside of the realm of responsibility. So they're not apt targets for the reactive attitudes, which basically structure interpersonal relationships. So they're like outside of the remit of normal human interactions. And so he says that towards these disordered people, we should we should basically treat them with either so he kind of suggests that we see them as objects of pity or caregiving or treatment or some kind of curative response, which is now seen as quite a paternalistic neurotypical attitude towards cognitively disabled people. So I think a lot of ableism comes from that essay actually.
I want to return to Strawson's objective attitude in a sec, but disability in your work it becomes sort of a limit case in the sense that the impaired agent who tests blame, mitigation, and exemption. Why does disability do so much boundary work for moral philosophy?
Yeah, so in Strawson's essay, he really describes the limit of responsibility as disability because he gives these central cases of non disabled agents, which are basically non neurotypical people. So he says that's the limiting case for responsibility. So these people are excluded from the moral community because of their cognitive impairments, essentially. So yeah, I think he's really describing how Western society actually works. Western society actively excludes cognitively disabled people, non neurotypical people, and also subjects them to forced treatment, forced hospitalization, and other kinds of paternalistic interventions that Strawson really uncritically recommends. So he's kind of endorsing the neurotypical norms of his culture at the time. So I think this is kind of unsurprising because he's a distinguished Oxford professor who's writing in mostly in very abstract terms about responsibility, but then focusing in on these specific cases of cognitively disabled people who are just obviously not capable of responsibility. So I think he's very much reflective of the ableist attitudes of the time. So this was like mid to mid to late 20th century. So at that time, this was kind of it was still the time of the asylum and mass institutionalization of anyone labeled as disabled, whether they were gender nonconforming, gay, or what have you, just kind of social outcasts, social misfits were being labeled as disabled and mass institutionalized. So Strawson was like pretty accurately describing the systemic, or I guess he was accurately describing the way institutions enforced responsibility at the time, or the way institutions viewed responsibility.
And within Strawson, you're critical of his objective attitude, where resentment is sort of suspended and replaced with management, handling, treatment, precaution. What forms of power become normalized through that shift, one would say?
Yeah, so I think philosophers in general have moved from a more retributive approach towards responsibility, where responsibility is used to punish people, towards a more therapeutic model of responsibility, where responsibility is used to rehabilitate people. And the problem is that rehabilitation within capitalism can be very coercive. Many people are still forcibly rehabilitated. So, like, they're subjected to rehabilitative therapy against their will just because they are social misfits, like just because they're disabled. So, one example is one of the main treatments for autism is a kind of behavioral intervention that's actually quite coercive. It presumes that autistic people have to be normalized and socialized into a more neurotypical way of living. And so it's imposing this neurotypical framework on autistic people, trying to coerce them to mask their autistic traits, essentially. So they can't like appear autistic in public. And this is actually considered one of the main forms of treatment, or for many years. It's become controversial, but for many years it was the dominant form of treatment for autism. So it assumes that autism is an impairment, not just a way of life. So I think that people who adopt the more therapeutic agency enhancement model of responsibility are ignoring that rehabilitation is a profitable business in capitalism that is often imposed on disabled people involuntarily.
Your usage of neoliberalism appears less as just like a static understanding of capitalism, and it's more as like a sort of reconfiguration of responsibility in which vulnerability is being individualized and risk is being privatized. How does neoliberalism reshape the figure of the responsible subject you critique in moral philosophy?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part? How does neoliberalism?
Sort of reshape that figure of the responsible subject you seek to critique in your work.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that the dominant view of responsibility comes from neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is interested in managing populations and trying to essentially extract labor and um ex- so it tries to orient human behavior towards productivity and the production of and surplus value, sorry. Surplus value for capitalists. So I think that within this framework, you mentioned risk earlier. Disabled people are seen as a risk or a liability because they can't necessarily be optimized in the correct way to produce surplus value. So they're seen as not as valuable to the economy, or to at least to like the production of billionaires. They're not as valuable to the billionaire class, essentially. So I think that this understanding of disability as like a cost it really informs the literature on responsibility, because responsibility theorists are interested in kind of optimizing people's agency, even if, so they typically don't talk about capitalism. It's kind of, they use this ideal theoretical model where responsibility is this abstract concept, and they don't really talk about economics, capitalism, neoliberalism, the global economy. But I think that's really critical to understanding where the mainstream notion of responsibility comes from, because capitalism tries to produce obedient, economically valuable subjects, and disability disrupts that project. So disability is really a threat. Like, this is why disability is construed as a risk or a liability, because it threatens the whole capitalist project, which is good. We want to disrupt capitalism, and disabled people have been extremely disruptive. Disabled people are the largest minority population in the world. They've done a lot of activism, and they've kind of leverage the idea that their existence threatens capitalism because they are largely unemployed, the main constituency of this surplus population, like the unemployed class. So their existence, like, or our existence as disabled, has a lot of liberatory, revolutionary potential, right? So this is very threatening to capitalism, and I think this is something that we should talk about in responsibility theory, about how disabled people, far from being non-responsible or marginal cases of responsibility, are responsible for some of the most revolutionary activism of all time. Like, disabled people are responsible for radically transforming the built environment. Disabled people are responsible for changing the definition of responsibility itself by changing the built environment, right? So instead of I think the literature really has things backwards. I mean, disabled people are responsible for so many structural changes, so many revolutionary changes, which is kind of erased when you just see disabled people as helpless victims, right?
And I think that in crisis discourse, neoliberal sort of states often claim limited capacity. But in terms of austerity, how does austerity sort of function biopolitically, not simply as like removing sort of social safety nets, but sort of as a redistribution of whose lives are like maintained and whose are exposed to abandonment in that sense?
Yeah, so austerity measures are really a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise disabled people and other minoritized populations. And I think that both liberals and conservatives have contributed to austerity measures and the gutting of the welfare state. And philosophers have actually written about this. So, for example, Bill Clinton was the Bill Clinton was the president who introduced workfare, or work for welfare, in the United States. So welfare was basically transformed under his administration to being relatively no strings attached, to being attached to the ability to work. So a lot of people were immediately denied benefits because they weren't able to meet the work requirement, right? And so it was actually a democratic government that gutted the welfare system and denied benefits to disabled people. But Republicans
Yeah.
enthusiastically endorsed workfare because they saw it as a way to transfer money from the public sector into the private sector. Because when workfare was introduced, the government gave contracts to private companies that would offer work training to unemployed people. Basically, they offered all kinds of like work training programs and incentives to um, welfare recipients, or like prospective welfare recipients. So money that would have gone directly to unemployed people or to jobless people instead went to these private contractors who offered relatively useless work training because it didn't actually create jobs or help place people in jobs. It was kind of smoke and mirrors. It was literally just a money grab. So I think in the US, Democrats and Republicans have been on the same page in terms of privatizing the public sector and contributing to what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. So, so austerity measures have been very devastating to disabled people, which I think is intended. But in terms of how this relates to responsibility, I think Democrats and Republicans have two different stories about why workfare is beneficial. So Republicans say workfare is good because welfare recipients are lazy, so, they don't deserve them. And then Democrats say workfare is good because it responsibilizes people, because this is actually beneficial to them. It improves their moral character. It helps socialize them. So they offer these more benevolent therapeutic justifications for workfare. They're not like welfare beneficiaries are leeches. They say, well, these are just poor innocent victims who need this help to responsibilize them. And so they're both using the language of responsibility, but one is more retributive and the other is more like clinical. But they both only care about dismantling the public sector. So the underlying logic is the same, even though they're using two different stories about responsibility to justify it.
This is very fascinating what you're talking about. I want to shift towards your article titled "Techno-Fascists Are Ruining the World." You resist the framing of AI and automation as sort of a rupture. Instead, you frame it as a historical continuity.
So I think I've written quite a bit about techno-fascism and techno-capitalism. I think that they roughly denote the same thing. So techno-capitalism is basically a system that it's just a capitalist system where technological developments are the main vehicle for channeling wealth to billionaires or to to capitalists, to the ruling class. So it's like a technologically fueled version of capitalism that ultimately um enhances economic divisions, right? So like the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And I think that techno-capitalism is obviously very bad for disabled people because they are largely left behind and exploited by modern technologies,
Mhm.
which are largely designed for able-bodied neurotypical people or for the benefit of the kind of the majority.
I was just going to add on that, like techno fascism also, you argue as well, intensifies overwork and environmental devastation and incarceration and disablement while speaking the language of efficiency and innovation. How does vulnerability and those things become compatible with these developments?
Yeah, so I think that techno-capitalism, it's how can I so yeah, so earlier you mentioned the kind of historical precedents for techno-capitalism. So I've written about how techno-capitalism is just an extension of earlier technologies that similarly disenfranchised and exploited marginalized groups. So for example, when the slave trade adopted modern technologies for extracting cotton, it actually increased the brutality of slavery because people were expected to pick more cotton in a shorter amount of time, and they were more severely punished for not meeting their quotas because it resulted in more of a financial loss for the plantation owner. So the quotas became more significant because there was so much money at stake, because these new technologies allowed people to basically process way more cotton than they could have without this kind of technological revolution. So it was ultimately harmful for enslaved people, right? And I think similarly today, over 100 years, hundreds of years later, over 100 years later, technology is still disenfranchising the most vulnerable people. It's really not conferring overall benefits. Like, yes, assistive technologies are helpful for disabled people, but I think in the grand scheme of things, the technological landscape is mostly benefiting capitalists and allowing them to, um, accumulate so much wealth and power that they're undermining democracy. They're buying elections or rigging elections. They're displacing marginalized communities to build servers and warehouses and basically entrenching structural injustices, including environmental injustice. So, although certain technologies can be beneficial to disabled people and they are legally entitled to have access to those technologies, just the system of techno-capitalism has been so devastating to disabled people and other historically disenfranchised groups.
You argue that crisis epistemology frames technological and social crisis as too technical and complex and urgent for democracy. What kinds of decision making power become normalized when crisis is treated as matters for experts and executives rather than collective judgment?
Yeah, so I got the notion of epistemologies of crisis from Kyle White, who talks about how this framework of crisis epistemology is used to justify modern day colonialism because he specifically focuses on climate change. So, technological or technocratic billionaires will use climate change, or even the government will use climate change as an excuse to basically buy green technologies, or develop green technologies that are in many ways harmful to that are in many sorry in many ways harmful to indigenous people. So these technologies might come from extractive processes that displace or exploit or poison indigenous people. They might basically be built in indigenous territories, even though they confer little to no benefit to local people. So, crisis technology is basically the idea that these crises like climate change, or like high unemployment, or economic recession, these are new crises that have to be dealt with urgently and without consultation with the people most affected by them. So the idea is these technocrats, these experts, have the knowledge required to deal with these crises. And so they should be in charge of crisis mitigation. But these are the people who are actually benefiting. Like, there's a conflict of interest there because they're benefiting from the crises. And they're the ones who created the crisis in the first place. People like Elon Musk have created, billionaires are responsible for the vast majority of climate change. And yet they're being positioned as the saviors who are going to protect us from climate change, who are going to mitigate climate change. So there's something very ironic about putting the people most responsible for climate change in charge of mitigating it. So essentially, the most marginalized should be they should be leading the charge against climate change. They should be leading the interventions into techno-capitalism. Basically, they should be like the leaders of thought. They should be responsible for the majority of governance because they have the most lived experience and wisdom that comes from surviving these exploitative systems. So,
And can you speak a little bit about disaster ableism and how it sort of deepens abandonment rather than suspends it? And whether disaster ableism extends what you describe in Crip Pessimism?
yeah, so Shelley Tremaine coined the term disaster ableism to describe how disaster capitalism disproportionately affects disabled people. And the example that she gives is medical assistance in dying in Canada, also known as MAID. So MAID was expanded during the pandemic without proper consultation with disabled people to allow more people to be eligible for medically assisted dying. And these would be disabled people who are not terminally ill. And so this was the government's way of very quickly and efficiently passing a bill that would lower the burden on the healthcare system. Is people who depend a lot of people who depend on that system would be dead. Meanwhile, they didn't invest in addressing structural ableism or providing people with resources that might alleviate their suffering and allow them to live a life of dignity with disability. So, this is the example she gives of it's one example of disaster ableism. And I think this can apply across a wide range of contexts. So, I guess, yeah.
So, how does disaster ableism reveal the latent eugenic logic embedded within public health and emergency sort of planning or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think that disasters are used as an excuse by governments and the private sector to sideline and abandon and kill disabled people. So the idea is we don't have time to consult with disabled people or invest in accessible infrastructure because of this crisis. So we're just going to pass these bills or policies that are ultimately not beneficial to disabled people because they're in the interest of the greater good. Like this will just benefit, this will take the burden off of the healthcare system. This will reduce spending. This will allow us to save money, or it'll increase the GDP, things that are totally irrelevant. Like, why would a disabled person care about the GDP? So basically disabled people are they're treated as expendable, right? Like basically this crisis is so urgent that disabled people can be pushed to the side. Like they're the solution can't like the solution has to be implemented immediately. So there's no time to consult with disabled activists.
Yeah. And so in that sense, disaster rhetoric often invokes collective survival while quietly ranking those whose survival counts. How does disaster ableism help us see the sorting mechanisms operating within crisis response?
Yeah, so I guess responses to crises tend to prioritize non-disabled people at the expense of disabled people. I thought of another example that I wrote about recently. So the Epstein files came out, and it turns out that Epstein and a lot of his friends and acquaintances were transhumanists who believe in breeding or genetically engineering a superior race of humans, which is a form of eugenics, and they think that this is absolutely necessary to prevent an impending apocalypse. So if we don't invest in eugenics, and if we don't selectively breed or genetically engineer superhumans with some kind of futuristic reproductive technologies, the world will end. The population will collapse. So they're using this theoretical, fabricated crisis to justify like classical eugenics. They actually talked in the Epstein files about having breeding ranches. So Epstein specifically said that he wanted to turn one of his ranches into a breeding ground where he would impregnate 20 women at a time because he wanted to seed the human race with his DNA. So there's some deep eugenic conversations happening in the Epstein files. And of course, to disabled people, this is totally appalling because we reject the notion of, or to disabled activists, we reject the notion of genetic hierarchy. We reject the notion that some genes are better than others and that we should select and propagate those genes. And we actually believe in the opposite, conserving and protecting disability as a valuable form of biological diversity. So we believe in the exact opposite of Jeffrey Epstein. But it's just very interesting that Epstein was a eugenicist who justified eugenics using the notion that the world will end. So there's this imminent crisis. Or sorry,
And what's interesting,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry,
sorry.
I think I'm also conflating. So Elon Musk, Elon Musk and Jeffrey Epstein held similar beliefs. So I think Elon Musk was the one who was obsessed with the apocalypse, but Jeffrey Epstein had very similar thoughts about the idea that disseminating his DNA would improve the human race and prevent some kind of like moral and social decline, essentially.
It was kind of interesting that you mentioned this because in that same article, uh, you're arguing that the contemporary sort of eugenics turn is a reconfiguration of the 20th century eugenics turn, right? And what structural features of classical eugenics persist beneath the sort of language of these so-called entrepreneurs who always speak in the language of efficiency and fitness, optimization, enhancement, like these technical words, right?
Yeah. Well, there are academic eugenicists working in bioethics who believe that we should optimize the human race and we should try to select basically embryos with better genes. We should select better children who have
Hmm.
socially valued genetic profiles. So eugenics is actually quite far reaching. I think a lot of people are eugenicists. So it certainly didn't die with the Nazi regime, but I think this is just a modern version of a very Nazi way of thinking about human value because eugenicists still want to create a superior stock of humans. But instead of using concentration camps and gas chambers, they want to use reproductive technologies like IVF and prenatal screening and basically different kinds of technologies to just eliminate disability in utero or, prior to conception. So they're using a different technique, but the goal is to select certain genetic profiles and ensure that only those profiles exist within the human race. The goal is still to eliminate
And
disability.
and and it's kind of interesting how the technical vocabulary sort of is being utilized to decide which lives are worth sort of fostering and which are marked as disposable. And, the usage of crisis discourse within eugenic reasoning is also pretty telling. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess eugenicists think that the crisis is that too many genetically defective people are being born and allowed to survive. So the crisis is really that the human gene pool is being polluted. Or they might think, the crisis is that not a well, I guess there are a few different things, but one of the main crises that they envision is the pollution of the human gene pool, and they want to maintain a kind of genetic purity. But disabled activists think the real crisis is eugenics. Eugenics is the crisis. The wide, the attempt, the widespread popular idea that we should try to genetically engineer ideal humans is the crisis. Is the crisis. So that's actually the thing that needs to be addressed, and it should be addressed by valuing and protecting disability, essentially. Yeah.
And I think you also discuss how, ableism and developmental hierarchies construct certain bodies as underdeveloped and impaired and economically non-viable. What does the developmental logic make eugenics appear? How does it make it not appear as violent,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
as a responsible thing?
Yeah. So I think that the medical model is very devoted to the notion that there are developmental stages, basically biologically appropriate developmental stages for human beings. So I don't remember the exact details, but at a certain age, humans should be able to walk and they should be able to talk and communicate using certain words, using a certain vocabulary. And there are basically all these developmental stages. And then even as an adult, you're expected to go to high school, get a job. So it's a little bit more social. It's a little more social rather than biological, but there's still this idea that you have to achieve these developmental goals. And CRIP theorists or critical disability theorists are generally against the notion of developmental stages because they're quite ableist, since some disabled people don't walk or don't talk, don't verbally communicate, don't necessarily get jobs since there's a very high unemployment rate for disabled people. So they don't reach these developmental milestones that are compulsory, basically, that are considered mandatory in mainstream society. And I think that the idea that there are these objective developmental stages does kind of validate eugenics, because eugenicists want to cultivate people who are capable of reaching all the developmental stages. If you can't reach one of those developmental stages, then are not worth bringing into existence, essentially. So yeah, I think that there's kind of a underlying logic to all of these medical concepts.
Yeah, and I know in the beginning of the interview we discussed for a brief period about crip pessimism. Could you go into detail about what crip pessimism actually is, and how you situate it in your broader research and philosophy?
Yeah, so I couldn't find much existing scholarship on crit pessimism. I could only find I found a dissertation and a paper from other disciplines outside of philosophy. So I don't think that crit pessimism is a very developed concept, but there are analogs in feminist theory and critical race theory. So I think Afro pessimism is the most popular one. I find Afro pessimism to be very interesting and compelling, and it's basically the idea that structural racism is permanent And so Black people will always be living with structural racism. And even though gains have been made through the civil rights movement, those gains are always compatible with white supremacy. So Crip pessimists have argued that Black people are only sort of within white supremacist cultures. Black people are only allowed to gain rights if it's compatible with white supremacy. So there's like a limit on how many rights they can be given, and that helps to explain the persistence of structural racism over many generations. And I think that the same logic can be applied to ableism. Like, why are disabled people so disenfranchised, even though the Americans with Disabilities Act and equivalent kind of legislation in Canada has been passed? Like, why are we still struggling with like such a high degree of structural ableism? I think it's because I guess ableism is kind of implacable. Like, I don't think we're ever going to transcend that and be in a post-ableist society. We're never going to achieve a post-ableist society or anything remotely close to a post-ableist society. I actually think that things will continue to get worse for the rest of my life and possibly the rest of time because of there are aggravating factors like intense climate change. So why, how I think climate change is kind of accelerating capitalist inequalities, and we can see billionaires creating these luxury bunkers and kind of becoming like even more exploitative and detached from basic morality. So I think that structural inequalities are accelerating. So yeah, I'm just not optimistic about disability justice, but I do say what I am optimistic about is the idea that disabled people can continue to build crip cultures, continue to foster solidarity and friendship and joy within their own communities and within their own, circle of friends. So I'm not like a hopeless person, but I just think that structurally, I don't see things improving. I actually envision an escalation of fascism to a much higher level, but I think that disabled people have always been very resilient and will persist, even in the worst circumstances.
And I just want to conclude with a couple. I guess like one thing I've seen in your work is that you unsettle this sort of toxic positivity and liberal optimism.
Yeah.
And I think Afro pessimism unsettles sort of the inclusion narrative within liberal optimism. And how do these pessimisms and how does pessimism sort of clarify the limits of recognition politics, but also just in your mind, how does it work in your understanding of disabilities and those things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not totally sure how to answer it, but I guess, so just I guess speaking to the point about recognition, institutions are always saying
Yeah.
they want to recognize and include and acknowledge disabled people, but then I don't see a lot of actual inclusion. And the strategies that they use to include and accommodate people are not really structural solutions. They're just kind of like piecemeal reformist policies that only help the most privileged disabled people. And they kind of leave the more disadvantaged disabled people behind. And that's kind of how liberalism works. It selectively includes the most privileged amongst oppressed groups. And so that's why we don't see a lot of social mobility or like structural justice or just material change. So yeah, I guess I don't think that like recognition politics or sort of liberal reformist politics, I don't think those will really even address structural injustices. So I guess I think really revolutionary change is needed to address ableism, and I hope that comes to fruition.
I want to conclude by asking you, what are you working on currently? I know you've had one book come out in 2020, I believe it was, but what is your current like line of research leaning towards? And are you working on any interesting projects moving forward?
Yeah, I actually would like to write another book on disability justice, kind of focusing on academic ableism, but I also really want to talk about not even the intersections, but the co-construction of disability with other marginalized positions. So kind of the social construction, or the co-construction of disability with race, gender, and animality, because my work tends to focus on how all of these problems intersect in really deep ways, to the extent that they can't be understood apart from each other. So lately I've actually been working on, and I'm editing a volume on animal liberation and disability justice. And what I write about in my chapter is how disability and animality are overlapping concepts, essentially, because the reason we oppress and exploit non-human animals is so the justification for the whole animal agricultural industry and the exploitation of other species is that they have lesser capacities than us, but specifically they have lesser capacities than the ideal neoliberal subject, the like neurotypical able-bodied subject. So non-human animals are outside of that ideal, so therefore they are fit for exploitation. And so I think ableism is a lot of work in justifying speciesism. And I would even say speciesism is ableism. Speciesism is ableism applied to non-human animals. They don't have the same capacities as the ideal neoliberal subjects, so we're going to incarcerate them in factory farms and consume them and exploit them in other ways, just like we incarcerate disabled people in clinical institutions. So I think speciesism and ableism are basically the same same kind of oppression. So I kind of in my book I want to explore how things that we consider to be different types of oppression are really the same. They operate on the same logic. They result in the same consequence, which is institutionalization. And they all kind of um they're basically all rooted in capitalism because they're all profitable.
Across your work, you return to barriers that barely budge and crisis that intensify exclusion and governance that reframes abandonment as responsibility. In that context, when we look at the current situation we are in globally, what does endurance look like without collapsing into optimism or other forms of toxic positivity, I guess you could say?
So I've actually written about resilience, which is similar to endurance. And there's this neoliberal notion of resilience, which basically says you should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You should thrive in the capitalist economy. And that kind of resilience is actually compulsory. So if you fail to be resilient, then you deserve your fate. Like you deserve to be excluded from the wage economy or whatever terrible things happen to you. So I think the neoliberal concept of resilience has been very harmful, especially to disabled people who don't meet that standard of resilience, that ideological notion of resilience. But I think there's another notion of resilience, or actually, I guess you could say there's another notion of resilience or endurance, which is more like survival. Like I think disabled people have been, surviving oppression for hundreds of years, for centuries, and disabled people are capable of obviously creating their own communities, their own cultures, their own their own identities, joy, pride. And so there is this kind of concept of resilience that we can apply to disabled communities. Like, in a way, they are flourishing because disabled people are, I would say, like disabled activists who reject the medical model are flourishing in the sense that we're liberated from capitalist value systems. Like, we don't define ourselves by the ableist gaze. So we're freer than other people to chart our own course and to form relationships outside of neoliberal constructs. So those relationships would be less transactional, less hierarchical, less oppressive. So I actually think that in crip cultures, disabled people are thriving. They have like a, very high degree of thriving. So yeah, I guess there's a kind of resilience that you find in crib culture that's very different from the neoliberal notion of resilience as assimilating into the wage economy.
Thank you, Mitch, for this amazing discussion and, just giving our audience something new to listen to. Again, thank you for appearing on the Organic Elements Network.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed my time here. Great questions, too.
Thank you.
I can tell you're
I
familiar with
really
my work.
appreciate it. That was our conversation with Mich Ciurria. We discussed Crip Pessimism, Responsibility, Crisis, Disaster, Ableism, and the resurgence of eugenic thinking under the language of innovation, and what it means to read recurrence as structure rather than failure. If you found this meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the Organic Filaments Network, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.